The Louisiana heat clung to Dr. James Whitfield's skin like a damp cloth as he stepped off the steamboat onto the bustling New Orleans dock in the summer of 1850. A respected physician from Boston, with a growing reputation in the emerging field of medical science, James had reluctantly accepted an invitation from Madame Delphine Lalaurie, a wealthy plantation owner whose correspondence had piqued his scientific curiosity. "Dr. Whitfield, welcome to New Orleans," a tall man in a crisp black suit called out, approaching with measured steps. "I am Henri Beaumont, Madame Lalaurie's solicitor. She sends her regrets that she could not greet you personally." James nodded, wiping perspiration from his brow. "The journey was long, but I am eager to discuss Madame Lalaurie's proposal. Her letters were intriguing, if somewhat vague." Henri's expression remained impassive. "Madame prefers discretion in her scientific pursuits. You'll understand once you see her work firsthand." The carriage ride to the Lalaurie plantation took them through the French Quarter, where the architectural beauty of the buildings stood in stark contrast to the human suffering James witnessed in the slave markets. He turned away as an auctioneer extolled the virtues of a young woman standing on the block, tears streaming silently down her face. "Does this disturb you, Doctor?" Henri asked, noticing James's discomfort. "I find the practice of owning human beings morally repugnant," James replied carefully, aware of the dangerous territory he was entering in the Deep South. Henri's lips tightened. "Madame Lalaurie considers herself progressive in her treatment of her property. You'll see her methods are quite enlightened." The plantation house emerged from behind a row of ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. The white-columned mansion glowed in the afternoon sun, its grandeur undeniable, yet somehow ominous. As they approached, James noticed the unusual height and thickness of the walls surrounding the estate's gardens and outbuildings. "Madame values her privacy," Henri explained, following James's gaze, "and the security of her investments." A slave in unusually fine livery opened the carriage door and bowed deeply. James noted the man's light complexion and startling blue eyes that contrasted with his African features. "Welcome to Maison Lalaurie, sir," the man said in perfectly accented French. "Madame awaits you in the parlor." The interior of the mansion was cooler, a relief from the oppressive heat. Ornate furnishings filled every room, displaying Madame Lalaurie's wealth and European tastes. The walls were adorned with paintings of stern-faced ancestors and landscapes of the French countryside. As they entered the parlor, a woman rose from a velvet settee. Madame Delphine Lalaurie was not what James had expected. In her mid-50s, she retained a commanding beauty, with sharp features and piercing grey eyes that seemed to evaluate him with clinical precision. "Dr. Whitfield," she said, extending her hand, "your reputation precedes you. I'm honored you accepted my invitation." James bowed slightly. "Your letters suggested a scientific breakthrough that could revolutionize human understanding. As a man of science, I could hardly refuse." A slight smile played on Madame Lalaurie's lips. "Indeed. But you must be exhausted from your journey. We'll discuss my work tomorrow. Tonight, you'll dine with me and rest." During dinner, served by the same light-skinned slave who had greeted them, James attempted to learn more about his hostess's scientific pursuits. "Patience, Doctor," she replied, sipping her wine. "Tomorrow I'll show you what no other outsider has seen. I've created something remarkable here. A method of selective breeding that produces not just stronger, more obedient workers, but something approaching perfection in human form and temperament." A chill ran down James's spine despite the warm evening. "You speak of human beings as if they were livestock, Madame." Delphine Lalaurie's eyes hardened momentarily before her smile returned. "Science must sometimes divorce itself from sentimentality, Doctor. Surely you agree that progress requires certain sacrifices." That night, as James prepared for bed in his luxurious guest room, he heard a faint sound, a cry quickly muffled, coming from somewhere below his window. He peered out into the moonlit garden, but saw only shadows and swaying trees. As he turned away, a movement caught his eye, a figure hurrying across the grounds toward what appeared to be a hidden entrance in the garden wall. Sleep came fitfully to James Whitfield that night, his dreams haunted by the muffled cry and the unsettling conversation with his hostess. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stepped into something far darker than a mere scientific experiment. Dawn broke over the Lalaurie plantation, casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. James had risen early, disturbed by the sounds that had penetrated his dreams, distant cries that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. He'd convinced himself it was simply his imagination, fueled by the unsettling conversation with Madame Lalaurie the previous evening. A soft knock at his door announced the arrival of breakfast, carried by a young woman whose complexion was several shades lighter than the man who had greeted him yesterday. Her eyes were a startling green against her light brown skin. "Good morning, sir," she said, her voice melodious but flat, as if carefully trained to show no emotion. "Madame requests your presence in the East Garden, following your breakfast. I'm to escort you when you're ready." James thanked her, noting the unusual composure of her demeanor. "What is your name?" he asked gently. "I'm called Esther, sir," she replied, her eyes never meeting his. "Are you treated well here, Esther?" James asked, lowering his voice. For a moment, something flickered across Esther's face. Fear, perhaps, or warning. "Madame is most scientific in her methods," she answered carefully. "I was born here, sir. I know no other life." After breakfast, Esther led James through the house to a door opening onto a walled garden. The humid morning air carried the scent of magnolias and something else, medicinal and sharp. Madame Lalaurie waited beside a fountain, dressed impeccably in dark blue silk, despite the early hour. "Dr. Whitfield, I trust you slept well?" she inquired, though her tone suggested little actual concern for his comfort. "Well enough," James replied, "though I thought I heard some disturbance in the night." Madame Lalaurie's smile remained fixed. "The plantation is never truly silent, Doctor. There is always work to be done." She gestured for him to follow her along a gravel path that wound through immaculately maintained rose bushes. "What I'm about to show you represents 25 years of careful selection and breeding. My late husband thought me mad at first, but even he came to appreciate the scientific value of my work." They approached a separate building, smaller than the main house but still substantial, with barred windows and a heavy locked door. Madame Lalaurie produced a key from her pocket. "This is my nursery," she explained, unlocking the door, "where the future of my experiment takes its first breath." The interior was unexpectedly bright and clean, resembling a hospital ward more than a plantation outbuilding. Several women, all with varying shades of light brown skin, cared for infants in wooden cradles. The women wore identical white dresses, their hair covered with white caps. "These children represent the 4th generation of my program," Madame Lalaurie said proudly. "I began with careful selection of breeding pairs, choosing for intelligence, physical attributes, and most importantly, temperament." James felt nausea rising in his throat. "You speak of human beings, Madame." "I speak of progress, Doctor," she countered smoothly. "Each generation has shown improvements. The children are healthier, more intelligent, and more tractable than their forebears. And observe their coloring. I've nearly achieved the perfect shade." James looked more closely at the infants. Indeed, they shared a remarkably uniform light brown complexion, with features that blended European and African characteristics in an uncanny harmony. "You're breeding for skin color?" he asked, unable to keep the horror from his voice. "Among other traits," Madame Lalaurie replied. "Lighter skin brings higher prices at market, of course, but more importantly, it creates a unified aesthetic. Uniformity breeds harmony, Doctor." She led him to a crib where a particularly fair-skinned infant lay sleeping. "This one is my greatest success so far. 3rd-generation breeding for loyalty traits combined with the coloring program." His father would die for me without hesitation, and his mother has never shown the slightest resistance to any command." James felt the room spinning slightly. The clinical detachment with which Madame Lalaurie discussed her breeding program made his skin crawl. Yet he forced himself to maintain a professional demeanor, knowing that any display of revulsion might end his access, and he was beginning to suspect that something even darker lurked beneath the surface of this woman's scientific facade. "And those who don't meet your standards?" he asked carefully. "What becomes of them?" A shadow passed over Madame Lalaurie's face. "Nothing is wasted in my program, Doctor. Failed subjects still serve a purpose." She checked an ornate pocket watch. "But we have more to see. The nursery is merely the beginning. Now I'll show you how we train and evaluate the subjects as they mature." As they left the nursery, James noticed a heavily locked door at the far end of the corridor. "What's through there?" he inquired. "That's where we house the breeding stock," Madame Lalaurie replied matter-of-factly. "You'll see them later, after you've understood the full scope of my work." She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "I believe you'll find it quite illuminating." By midday, the heat had become oppressive, yet Madame Lalaurie showed no signs of discomfort as she led James across the grounds toward a long, low building with small, high windows. 2 armed men stood guard at the entrance, nodding respectfully as Madame approached. "This is our evaluation center," she explained, gesturing for the guards to unlock the heavy oak doors. "Children are brought here at age 7 for their first formal assessment." The interior was divided into compartments by canvas screens. In each section, a child performed various tasks under the watchful eye of a supervisor who made notes on a slate. Some children were reading aloud from books, others solving mathematical problems, while others demonstrated physical skills like balance and coordination. "We evaluate for intelligence, physical capability, and most importantly, temperament," Madame Lalaurie explained with clinical detachment. "Those who score highly in all categories continue in the prime program. Those with specialized aptitudes may be directed towards specific training." James watched as a small boy of perhaps 8 years meticulously copied a complex geometric pattern onto a slate, his concentration absolute despite the heat and the scrutiny. "And those who fail to meet your standards?" James asked, already dreading the answer. Madame Lalaurie's expression remained impassive. "Some are sold to traditional plantations where specialized skills aren't required. Others are assigned to manual labor here. Nothing is wasted." The coldness in her voice chilled James more than any explicit description of cruelty could have. She spoke of children as commodities, their futures determined by arbitrary standards she had established. They moved to another section, where older children, perhaps 12 or 13, stood perfectly still as a supervisor inspected their posture, teeth, and eyes. "Physical beauty is essential to my program," Madame Lalaurie continued. "I've found that aesthetically pleasing subjects are more likely to produce offspring with desirable temperaments. It's as if harmony of form creates harmony of spirit." James struggled to maintain his scientific facade as they proceeded through the building. In one section, teenagers were being taught to speak French with perfect Parisian accents. In another, they practiced serving meals with balletic precision. "You're creating servants," James observed. "I'm creating perfection," Madame Lalaurie corrected. "My subjects command the highest prices in New Orleans, but more importantly, they represent the future of scientific breeding. Imagine applying these principles more broadly. We could eliminate discord, stupidity, ugliness." They approached a final section, separated from the others by a solid wall rather than canvas. Madame Lalaurie paused, lowering her voice. "What you're about to see is the culmination of my work, the loyalty conditioning." She unlocked the door, revealing a stark room with a single chair bolted to the floor. A young man was seated there, his wrists and ankles secured with leather straps. Before him stood an older man, in a physician's coat, holding what appeared to be some form of electrical device. This subject showed signs of independent thinking, Madame Lalaurie explained casually. Dr. Reynolds is administering a corrective session. James watched in horror as Dr. Reynolds placed metal contacts on the young man's temples and turned a dial. The young man's body tensed, but remarkably he made no sound. We've found that electric stimulation, when properly applied, can eliminate undesirable thought patterns, Madame Lalaurie continued. The subject experiences pain when expressing independent thoughts and pleasure when demonstrating obedience. This is torture, James whispered, unable to contain himself. This is conditioning, Doctor, she replied sharply. No different from training any animal. The difference is that humans have the capacity to understand the process, which actually accelerates it. Dr. Reynolds noticed their presence and nodded deferentially to Madame Lalaurie. The subject is responding well to the treatment, madam. His resistance has decreased by 30% since yesterday. Excellent, she replied. Continue the protocol. She turned to James. We should proceed to the next facility. I believe you'll find our breeding program particularly interesting from a scientific perspective. As they left the building, James felt physically ill. He had come to Louisiana expecting some form of agricultural experimentation or perhaps medical research. Instead, he had entered a nightmare of human experimentation and cruelty disguised as scientific progress. You seem troubled, Doctor, Madame Lalaurie observed as they walked. Is the heat affecting you? James chose his words carefully, knowing he needed to maintain his access if he had any hope of exposing this horror. Your methods are more extreme than I anticipated. In Boston, such practices would be considered unethical. Madame Lalaurie smiled coldly. Ethics are a luxury of the North, Doctor. Here in Louisiana, we pursue progress without such encumbrances. By the time we've finished our tour, I believe you'll appreciate the scientific value of my work regardless of your northern sensibilities. Dim, as they crossed the grounds toward another walled compound, James noticed a small cemetery in the distance, the graves marked with simple wooden crosses. Madame Lalaurie followed his gaze. Not everyone survives the conditioning process, she said matter-of-factly, but their sacrifice contributes to the refinement of our methods. Nothing is wasted. James nodded numbly, his mind racing with plans to document everything he was seeing. Someone had to stop this woman, but he would need evidence, and for that, he would need to see everything, no matter how horrific. Show me your breeding program, he said, forcing scientific curiosity into his voice. I'm particularly interested in how you track hereditary traits. Madame Lalaurie's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. I knew you would understand the importance of my work eventually, Doctor. Come, the best is yet to be revealed. The breeding facility stood apart from the other buildings, surrounded by its own high wall topped with iron spikes. As they approached, James noticed the windows were not only barred, but covered with heavy drapes from the inside. 2 armed guards flanked the entrance, their expressions impassive as Madame Lalaurie approached. Security is essential here, she explained, producing another key from the ring at her waist. This building houses my most valuable investments. The heavy door swung open to reveal a central corridor with smaller rooms branching off on either side. The air inside was stifling, thick with the scent of medicinal compounds and something else, fear perhaps, or despair. Each breeding pair is carefully selected based on physical characteristics, intelligence scores, and temperament assessments, Madame Lalaurie explained, leading James down the corridor. We maintain detailed records of each pairing and the resulting offspring. She stopped at a wooden cabinet filled with ledgers, each labeled with a year. Opening one from 1845, she displayed pages of meticulous notes detailing physical measurements, behavioral observations, and genealogical charts tracing bloodlines back several generations. This is quite comprehensive, James remarked, fighting to maintain his scientific demeanor while inwardly recoiling at the clinical objectification of human beings. Science requires precision, Madame Lalaurie replied. I can trace the inheritance of specific traits through 4 generations now. The results are remarkable. We've nearly eliminated resistance behaviors in our latest cohort." She led him to a closed door and paused, lowering her voice. "The subjects are kept in separate quarters except during fertile periods, which we track meticulously. Breeding occurs under supervision to ensure proper pairing." James's stomach turned, but he forced himself to nod professionally. "May I see the accommodations?" Madame Lalaurie unlocked the door, revealing a small, sparse room containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and nothing else. A young woman sat on the bed, her eyes downcast. She wore a simple white shift, and her light brown skin bore an unmistakable resemblance to Esther, who had served James breakfast. "Subject 47, Madame Lalaurie announced. 3rd generation, daughter of subjects 22 and 35. Note the refined bone structure and the excellent skin tone, precisely the shade we've been cultivating." The young woman didn't move or acknowledge their presence in any way. She might have been a statue, but for the slight rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. "Why doesn't she react to our presence?" James asked, disturbed by her emptiness. "Perfect temperament," Madame Lalaurie replied with satisfaction. "Complete docility achieved through selective breeding and conditioning. She'll produce excellent offspring when paired with subject 51 next month." James approached the young woman cautiously. "May I speak with her?" Madame Lalaurie shrugged. "If you wish, though you'll find conversation limited. We discourage independent thought in the breeding subjects." "What is your name?" James asked gently, kneeling to meet the woman's gaze. Slowly, she raised her eyes to his. They were vacant, devoid of the spark that defined humanity. "I am subject 47, she replied in a whisper. "I serve Madame." "Are you treated well here?" James pressed, aware of Madame Lalaurie watching closely. "I serve Madame," the woman repeated, her voice mechanical. Madame Lalaurie placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You see? Perfect temperament. No resistance, no unnecessary thoughts to distract from her purpose." They left the room, Madame Lalaurie locking the door behind them. James felt sick, but forced himself to continue the charade of scientific interest. "What of the male subjects?" he inquired. "They're housed in the East Wing," she replied. "Segregation prevents unauthorized breeding. We allow controlled interaction during non-fertile periods as a behavioral reward, but only for subjects who demonstrate perfect obedience." As they walked toward the East Wing, a commotion erupted from one of the rooms, a crash followed by angry voices. Madame Lalaurie's expression hardened as a guard rushed toward them. "Madame, subject 43 has become violent again," the guard reported. "He attacked Dr. Reynolds during his examination." "Restrain him," Madame Lalaurie ordered coldly. "I'll observe the correction personally." She turned to James. "You may find this educational, Doctor. Despite our best efforts, regression occasionally occurs, particularly in male subjects." They followed the guard to a room where 2 men were restraining a struggling young man, while Dr. Reynolds prepared what appeared to be a surgical tray. "Subject 43, Madame Lalaurie announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This is your 3rd infraction this month." The young man ceased struggling momentarily, his eyes finding Madame Lalaurie's. Unlike subject 47, his gaze burned with hatred and defiance. "I am not your subject," he spat. "I am a man. My name is Thomas." Madame Lalaurie's expression remained impassive. "Commence the procedure, Dr. Reynolds." "What procedure?" James asked, alarmed by the surgical instruments being arranged. "Subject 43 has proven resistant to standard conditioning," Madame Lalaurie explained clinically. "Dr. Reynolds will perform a partial lobotomy to remove the centers of resistance in his brain. It's a relatively new technique, but we've had promising results with similar cases." Horror flooded through James. "You can't be serious." "That's scientific progress," Madame Lalaurie interrupted sharply. "I understood you to be a man of science, Dr. Whitfield. Surely you recognize that advancement requires experimentation." James watched, as the struggling young man was forced onto a table and restrained. Dr. Reynolds approached with a thin metal instrument resembling an ice pick. "I've refined the technique, Doctor," Reynolds explained proudly. "The entry through the eye socket minimizes visible scarring and, when done correctly, leaves basic functions intact while eliminating problematic behaviors." "Stop!" James shouted, unable to contain himself any longer. "This is barbaric!" Madame Lalaurie turned to him, her eyes cold. "I'm disappointed, Doctor. I had hoped you would appreciate the scientific significance of my work," she signaled to the guards. "Perhaps Dr. Whitfield would benefit from some rest before we continue our tour. Escort him to his quarters." As the guards moved toward him, James backed away. "You can't simply lobotomize a man for disobedience. This goes beyond science into sadism." "Your northern sensibilities are showing, Doctor," Madame Lalaurie replied with a thin smile. "Remember where you are. In Louisiana, my methods are not subject to your Boston ethics committees." As the guards grasped his arms, James heard the young man on the table shout, "Help us! Tell people what she's doing here!" The last thing James saw before being dragged from the room was Dr. Reynolds positioning his instrument at the corner of the young man's eye, while Madame Lalaurie watched with clinical interest. The guards escorted James back to his room with firm grips on his arms, but stopped short of physically restraining him. Once inside, he heard the unmistakable click of a key turning in the lock. He was now a prisoner in the Lalaurie mansion. James paced the confines of his luxurious cage, mind racing. What he had witnessed went beyond the already abhorrent practice of slavery into something monstrous, human experimentation disguised as scientific breeding. The clinical detachment with which Madame Lalaurie approached her subjects chilled him to the core. He had to find a way to document her atrocities. Simply escaping and reporting what he'd seen wouldn't be enough. Who would believe such horrors without evidence? Especially coming from a northerner about a respected southern socialite. As dusk fell, casting long shadows across his room, James heard the key turn again. The door opened to reveal Henri Beaumont, Madame Lalaurie's solicitor. "Madame sends her regrets that you found today's demonstrations unsettling," Henri said smoothly. "She requests your presence at dinner, where she hopes to clarify the scientific merits of her program." James hesitated, torn between refusing in moral outrage and maintaining the pretense that might allow him to gather evidence. "Please inform Madame that I will join her shortly," he finally replied. "I merely needed time to process the innovative nature of her work." Henri nodded, seemingly satisfied with this response. "Dinner will be served in 1 hour. Madame has instructed the staff to provide you with anything you require to refresh yourself." After Henri departed, leaving the door tellingly unlocked, James splashed water on his face and considered his options. Direct confrontation would be foolish. Madame Lalaurie clearly held complete power here, and her guards would not hesitate to restrain him, or worse. His only hope was to play along, express scientific interest, and find an opportunity to collect evidence. The dining room glowed with candlelight when James entered, the table set with fine china and crystal that reflected the flames in fractured patterns. Madame Lalaurie sat at the head, dressed in deep burgundy silk that reminded James uncomfortably of blood. "Dr. Whitfield," she greeted him cordially, as if their earlier confrontation had never occurred. "I trust you've had time to reflect on our morning's tour?" James forced a polite smile. "Indeed, Madame, I apologize for my emotional response earlier. In Boston, we're unaccustomed to such direct methods of advancing science." Madame Lalaurie's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing his sincerity before she gestured for him to be seated. "Science has always required courage, Doctor. Those who push boundaries are rarely understood in their time." Dinner was served by the same light-skinned slaves James had seen before, their movements mechanically precise, their expressions blank. The food was exquisite, Creole delicacies prepared to perfection, but James could barely eat, his stomach still churning from the day's horrors. "I'm particularly interested in your record-keeping methods," James said, steering the conversation toward what might yield useful evidence. "Your genealogical charts are impressively detailed." Madame Lalaurie brightened, clearly pleased by his interest. "My ledgers are my legacy, Doctor. 25 years of careful observation and documentation. Future generations will study my methods when the rest of the world catches up to my understanding of human improvement. I would very much appreciate examining your records more thoroughly," James pressed. "From a scientific perspective, of course." "Of course," she agreed, sipping her wine. "Tomorrow morning I'll have Henri show you my private library. My complete records are kept there, including my experimental notes from the early years." James felt a surge of hope. If he could somehow copy or steal those records, he would have the evidence needed to expose her. "There's something I've been curious about," he said carefully. "How did you develop your interest in human improvement?" A shadow crossed Madame Lalaurie's face. "My first husband was weak, physically, morally. His bloodline was tainted with instability that manifested in our eldest son." She set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "I watched that weakness destroy what should have been a great family legacy. After his death, I vowed to understand how human quality is inherited and how it might be controlled." "And your current methods? How did you develop them?" "Trial and error, initially," she admitted. "The early years were less scientific, more intuitive, but I studied animal breeding extensively and consulted with physicians about human heredity. By my third marriage to Dr. Lalaurie, I had established basic protocols." Her eyes took on a distant quality. "Leonard, Dr. Lalaurie, provided valuable medical insights before his untimely death." Something in her tone made James wonder about the circumstances of that death, but he didn't dare ask directly. Instead, he guided the conversation toward the practical aspects of her program, encouraging her to elaborate on her methods while expressing appropriate scientific interest. By the time dinner concluded, Madame Lalaurie had consumed several glasses of wine and grown increasingly animated in describing her achievements. James had learned that her breeding program had produced over 100 individuals across 4 generations, that she maintained detailed physical and behavioral metrics for each subject, and that her ultimate goal was nothing less than creating what she called the perfect servant class, humans bred specifically for docility, intelligence, aesthetic appeal, and absolute loyalty. "Tomorrow, you'll see everything," she promised as they retired for the evening. "My complete records, my experimental facilities, even my failures, preserved for scientific study." The mention of preserved failures sent another chill through James, but he maintained his facade of interest. "I look forward to it, Madame. Your work deserves thorough documentation." Back in his room, James waited until the house fell silent before carefully trying his door. It was locked again. Evidently, Madame Lalaurie's trust only extended so far. He moved to the window, considering whether escape might be possible, but the drop was substantial, and he could see guards patrolling the grounds below. As he turned from the window, a soft knock startled him. He opened the door cautiously to find Esther, the slave who had served his breakfast, standing in the hallway with a pitcher of water. "Fresh water for the night, sir," she whispered, entering quickly and closing the door behind her. Once inside, her demeanor changed subtly, her eyes showing a spark of awareness that had been absent earlier. "You must help us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's planning something special for tomorrow's demonstration, something terrible." James's heart raced. "What is she planning?" "A new procedure. Dr. Reynolds has developed a way to remove all will without affecting physical abilities." Esther's hands trembled as she set down the pitcher. "They're going to use Thomas, subject 43, to demonstrate. If it works, she'll apply it to all breeding subjects who show any resistance." "I want to help," James assured her, "but I'm locked in at night, and there are guards everywhere." Esther reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a map of the underground passages beneath the mansion. They were built during the Spanish occupation for smuggling. Madame uses them to move subjects between buildings unseen. James unfolded the crude map, studying it by moonlight. This could work, but I'll need evidence of what's happening here, or no one will believe me. The ledgers, Esther said urgently, in her private study. They document everything, the breeding pairs, the failed experiments, the punishments. She glanced fearfully at the door. I must go before I'm missed. The key to your room is hanging in the kitchen. I can bring it tomorrow night if you're still yourself. Huh? After Esther departed, James studied the map by moonlight until he had committed it to memory, then burned it in the candle flame. Tomorrow would be dangerous. Madame Lalaurie clearly had something horrific planned, but it might be his only chance to gather the evidence needed to expose her crimes. As he finally drifted into uneasy sleep, James's last thought was of Thomas, the young man who had defiantly claimed his humanity in the face of Madame Lalaurie's monstrous science. Would he still have that spark of defiance tomorrow, or would Dr. Reynolds's procedure extinguish it forever? James awoke to the sound of rain against the windows, a welcome respite from the previous day's oppressive heat. The grey morning light cast somber shadows across his room as he prepared himself for what lay ahead. Today, he would need to maintain the facade of scientific interest while looking for an opportunity to access Madame Lalaurie's ledgers and potentially find a way to help Thomas and the others. A different slave brought his breakfast this morning, a young man with the now familiar light brown skin and vacant expression. James attempted conversation, but received only minimal responses, further evidence of Madame Lalaurie's conditioning methods. Shortly after he finished eating, Henri Beaumont arrived to escort him. Madame Lalaurie sends her apologies, but urgent business in the city requires her attention this morning, he explained. She has instructed me to show you her private library and research collection as promised. This unexpected turn of events sent James's mind racing with possibilities. Without Madame Lalaurie's watchful presence, might he have a better chance of collecting evidence? Henri led him through a different wing of the mansion to a handsomely appointed library, with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes. At the center stood a massive oak desk covered with papers, ledgers, and scientific instruments. Madame's life work, Henri announced with a gesture that encompassed the room. She has authorized you to examine any materials that interest you. I'll return in 2 hours to escort you to lunch, after which Madame will join us for the afternoon's demonstration. Once alone, James moved quickly to the desk where several ledgers lay open. The most recent contained detailed measurements of infants born within the past year, with annotations about their parentage, physical characteristics, and early behavioral observations. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horror of what he was reading. Human beings reduced to breeding stock, their offspring evaluated like livestock. James needed evidence he could remove from the mansion. Looking around, he spotted a small leather case that might have contained drawing supplies. Opening it, he found pencils, charcoal, and several sheets of thin paper, perfect for making copies of the most damning pages. For the next hour, James worked furiously, creating tracings of genealogical charts, copying passages that detailed Madame Lalaurie's conditioning methods, and documenting the names and descriptions of her victims. He paid particular attention to records mentioning Thomas, subject 43, learning that the young man was the product of a pairing that had been intended to produce docility, but had instead resulted in what Madame Lalaurie termed regressive independence traits. As he worked his way through the materials, James discovered a locked cabinet beneath one of the bookshelves. The key was not immediately visible, but after searching the desk drawers, he found a small brass key that fit the lock. Inside the cabinet, James found older ledgers dating back to the 1820s, the early years of Madame Lalaurie's experiments. These records were far less clinical and more disturbing, documenting failed attempts at conditioning that had resulted in deaths, along with crude anatomical drawings of dissected brains labeled with observations about areas possibly responsible for obedience and resistance. Most disturbing was a thin volume containing what appeared to be Dr. Lalaury's personal journal, with entries that expressed increasing concern about his wife's methods. The final entry, dated just days before his reported death from fever, contained a chilling passage. D has gone too far. What began as scientific inquiry has become something monstrous. I have expressed my intention to report certain activities to the authorities, and now I find myself suddenly ill with symptoms that defy medical explanation. I fear that I have underestimated what she is capable of. James quickly copied this passage, his hands shaking with the implication that Madame Lalaurie had murdered her own husband to protect her secrets. As he was returning the journal to its place, he heard footsteps approaching the library door. Hastily closing the cabinet and locking it, he slipped the key into his pocket and returned to the desk just as Henri entered. "I trust you found Madame's records illuminating?" Henri inquired, his expression revealing nothing. "Quite," James replied, discreetly folding his copied papers and slipping them into his coat pocket. "Madame Lalaurie's documentation is impressively thorough." "She will be pleased to hear it," Henri said. "Lunch has been prepared. Afterward, we will proceed to the laboratory for this afternoon's demonstration." During lunch, served in a smaller dining room overlooking the rain-soaked garden, James carefully steered conversation toward the mansion's history, confirming Esther's information about underground passages. Indeed, the original Spanish owner was reputed to be a smuggler, Henri acknowledged. "There are said to be tunnels connecting various buildings on the property, though I've never explored them myself." "Fascinating," James remarked, trying to sound merely academically interested. "Such architectural features are quite common in old New Orleans properties, I understand." After lunch, Henri led James across the grounds to a building he hadn't seen before, a brick structure with no windows and a single heavy door guarded by 2 armed men. Unlike the other facilities, this one bore no pretense of being anything other than what it was, a place of confinement and experimentation. Inside, the air was cool and smelled strongly of chemicals, ether, formaldehyde, and others James couldn't immediately identify. The central room was arranged like an anatomical theatre, with a metal table at the center surrounded by tiered seating. Dr. Reynolds was already present, arranging instruments on a small trolley beside the table. "Ah, Dr. Whitfield," Reynolds greeted him with unsettling enthusiasm. "You're just in time. We're preparing for a significant advancement in our conditioning techniques." Before James could respond, the door opened again, and Madame Lalaurie entered, followed by 2 guards escorting Thomas, whose hands and feet were chained. Despite this, and despite the visible bruising on his face suggesting recent beatings, Thomas's eyes still burned with defiance. "Dr. Whitfield?" Madame Lalaurie nodded in greeting. "I trust Henri showed you my records this morning?" "He did," James confirmed. "Your documentation is impressively comprehensive." "Science requires precision," she replied, her attention already shifting to Thomas. "Subject 43 continues to demonstrate the failure rate in 3rd-generation breeding. Despite optimal genetic selection, environmental controls, and standard conditioning, he persists in expressing independence traits." Thomas spat on the ground at her feet. "My name is Thomas Wilson. My mother was Grace Wilson. I am a man, not your subject." Madame Lalaurie's expression didn't change. "Secure him to the table," she instructed the guards. "Today we will demonstrate a refined procedure that addresses the neurological basis of resistance without compromising physical function or basic intelligence." As the guards forced Thomas onto the metal table and secured his limbs with leather straps, James frantically considered his options. He couldn't physically intervene, he was outnumbered and unarmed, but he couldn't stand by and watch this atrocity either. Madame Lalaurie, he began, while I appreciate the scientific aspects of your work, surely there are less invasive methods of behavioral modification worth exploring before resorting to irreversible surgical intervention. Madame Lalaurie regarded him with cold amusement. Your northern sensibilities are showing again, Doctor. This subject has proven resistant to every non-invasive method we've employed. He represents a potential corruption of my breeding line if his traits are heritable. She turned to Dr. Reynolds. Proceed with the demonstration. As Dr. Reynolds approached with a syringe containing what was likely an anesthetic, James made a desperate decision. Before you begin, he said loudly, I'd like to ask the subject a few questions, for the scientific record, of course, to establish a baseline of cognitive function that can be compared to post-procedure results. Madame Lalaurie considered this, then nodded. A reasonable scientific precaution. Proceed, but be brief. We have limited time before the anesthetic must be administered. James approached the table, positioning himself between Dr. Reynolds and Thomas. Meeting Thomas's eyes, he tried to convey that he was not their ally in this horror. Subject 43, he began formally, for Madame Lalaurie's benefit, then lowered his voice slightly. Thomas, can you tell me about your mother? Thomas's eyes widened slightly at the use of his name, perhaps recognizing that James was not fully complicit. My mother taught me my name, he said quietly. She told me stories of her mother, who was born free. She taught me that I am a man, not an animal, not a subject. She died when I was 10. They said it was fever, but it was a broken heart. And your father? James asked, trying to maintain the appearance of a clinical interview while signaling his true purpose to Thomas. They called him Subject 28, Thomas replied, his voice strengthening. But his name was Samuel. He tried to escape when I was 6. They caught him at the property line. His eyes flicked toward Madame Lalaurie. She made us all watch what happened to him. As a lesson, James nodded, making notes as if this were valuable scientific information rather than testimony of atrocities. One final question, he said, leaning closer. If you had the chance to leave this place, what would you do? Thomas's eyes burned into his. I would tell the world what happens here, and then I would burn it to the ground. That's quite enough, Doctor. Whitfield, Madame Lalaurie interrupted sharply, your baseline assessment is complete. Dr. Reynolds will proceed now. But as Dr. Reynolds approached with the syringe, James deliberately stepped back, knocking over the instrument tray with a tremendous crash. Scalpels, forceps, and glass vials shattered across the floor. My sincerest apologies, James exclaimed, bending to help gather the fallen instruments, deliberately creating more chaos. In the confusion, he whispered urgently to Thomas, Tonight, tunnels beneath the kitchen. Be ready. Whether Thomas heard or understood was impossible to tell, as the guards pulled James away and Dr. Reynolds angrily began gathering his scattered instruments. Perhaps Dr. Whitfield should observe from a distance, Madame Lalaurie suggested coldly. His enthusiasm for science seems to overwhelm his physical coordination. James was escorted to the tiered seating, where he watched in helpless horror as Dr. Reynolds administered the anesthetic. Thomas struggled briefly, then went limp. The procedure that followed was mercifully brief, but unmistakably barbaric. A thin metal tool inserted through the inner corner of the eye socket, manipulated with small movements, then withdrawn. The modification targets specific structures in the prefrontal cortex, Dr. Reynolds explained proudly. When he wakes, you'll observe complete docility without loss of motor function or basic intelligence. Throughout the procedure, James maintained his facade of scientific interest, while inwardly making a solemn vow he would not leave New Orleans without exposing Madame Lalaurie's atrocities and doing everything in his power to free her victims. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a nightmare of demonstrations, as Madame Lalaurie proudly displayed other aspects of her program. James was shown the graduating class, young men and women who had completed their training and conditioning and were ready to be sold to wealthy New Orleans families. Their uniformly light brown skin and vacant expressions haunted him, as did their perfect, empty recitations of poetry and flawless performances of musical pieces, all delivered without a hint of emotion or self-awareness. By the time James was escorted back to his room to prepare for dinner, his copied pages of evidence felt like they were burning a hole in his pocket. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, not just to escape with his documentation, but somehow to help Thomas and the others, if possible. Dinner that evening was a grotesque affair. Madame Lalaurie entertained several guests, wealthy New Orleans socialites who had come to preview her latest offerings. They discussed the human beings presented to them as if they were examining furniture or horses, commenting on their appearance, deportment, and skills with casual disregard for their humanity. Madame Lalaurie's subjects fetch the highest prices in Louisiana, remarked a corpulent banker, eyeing a young woman who stood motionless against the wall. My wife's maid was purchased from Madame 5 years ago, and she has never shown the slightest disobedience or discontent. The secret is in the breeding, Madame Lalaurie replied, accepting the compliment with a gracious nod. Selective pairing over generations, combined with my proprietary conditioning methods. James forced himself to eat, to smile at the appropriate moments, to maintain his cover as an interested scientific observer. Inside, he was calculating possibilities, considering timing, weighing risks. After dinner, Madame Lalaurie invited her guests to retire to the parlor for brandies, but James begged off, claiming fatigue from the day's intellectual stimulation. "I find I must process what I've learned today, Madame," he explained. "Your methods have given me much to consider." Madame Lalaurie seemed pleased by this. "Of course, Doctor. Rest well. Tomorrow I'll show you my long-term research subjects, those who have been with the program since its inception. Some quite interesting genetic developments have manifested in the oldest specimens." Back in his room, James waited, listening to the sounds of the house as the dinner party continued downstairs. Eventually, the guests departed, and the mansion grew quiet, except for the occasional footsteps of slaves completing their evening duties. Around midnight, a soft knock at his door announced Esther's arrival. She entered quickly, carrying a folded nightshirt as if delivering fresh linens. Once inside, she withdrew a key from her pocket. "This will open your door from the inside," she whispered. "The guards change at 2 o'clock. That's when you should move." "What about Thomas?" James asked urgently. "I saw what they did to him today." Esther's expression darkened. "Dr. Reynolds's procedure failed. Thomas pretended to be docile when he awoke, but he's still himself. They've locked him in the isolation cell in the basement of the laboratory building." "Can we reach him through the tunnels?" "Yes, but it's guarded. One man, usually half asleep by 2 in the morning." Esther hesitated. "There are others who want to escape, too, those who've managed to resist the conditioning or hide their resistance. I've spoken to some of them." James considered this. "How many?" 7, including Thomas and myself. The others are in the breeding quarters, and they're all willing to risk it. The punishment, if caught, would be severe." Esther's eyes flashed with determination. "Death would be preferable to what happens here, Dr. Whitfield." James nodded grimly. "We'll need a distraction, something to draw attention away from our escape route." An idea formed in his mind. The ledgers. Madame Lalaurie values them above everything. "The study is locked at night, and she keeps the key with her," Esther warned. James reached into his pocket, producing the brass key he had taken from the library. "This opens the cabinet containing her oldest records. If a fire were to start in that cabinet—" Esther's eyes widened. "The entire mansion could burn." "Not if it's discovered and contained quickly," James clarified. "We just need enough of a distraction to cover our escape. And if some of her records are destroyed in the process, all the better." They spent the next hour refining their plan. Esther would return to the kitchen and leave the outside door unlocked. She would then alert the others who wished to escape. James would create the distraction in the library, then make his way to the kitchen and into the tunnels, where he would meet Esther and the others. "What about after?" Esther asked. "Where will we go? I have colleagues in Boston, abolitionists with connections to the Underground Railroad," James replied. "But first, we need to get to the city. Is there anyone there you trust?" "My cousin works at the docks. If we can reach him, he might be able to hide us until arrangements can be made." She hesitated. "But Madame Lalaurie is powerful in New Orleans. She has friends among the authorities." "Then we'll need to expose her crimes quickly," James said, patting his pocket where the copied pages were hidden. "These records contain enough evidence to destroy her reputation, even in New Orleans." As Esther prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Why are you helping us, Dr. Whitfield? You risk your life by doing so." James thought of Thomas strapped to that table, of the vacant-eyed young woman in the breeding quarters, of the systematic destruction of human will that Madame Lalaurie called science. "Because what happens here is an abomination," he said simply, "and because I couldn't live with myself if I walked away." After Esther departed, James prepared for the escape attempt. He changed into darker clothing, packed his few belongings, and most importantly, secured the copied pages inside his coat. Then he waited, watching the hands of the mantel clock inch toward 2 o'clock. At 1:15, he heard a commotion from downstairs, voices raised in alarm, hurried footsteps. James tensed, wondering if their plan had somehow been discovered. But the noises faded, followed by the sound of the front door opening and closing. Perhaps Madame Lalaurie had been called away on some emergency. This unexpected development might work in their favor. James decided to move ahead of schedule. Using Esther's key, he unlocked his door and peered into the darkened hallway. It was empty. He moved silently toward the staircase, keeping to the shadows. The main floor was dimly lit by a few oil lamps left burning through the night. James made his way to the library, encountering no one. Inside, he worked quickly. He used a lamp to ignite several papers in the cabinet containing the oldest records, making sure the fire caught before slipping out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar so the smoke would eventually be noticed. As he headed toward the kitchen, James heard a shout from the direction of the library. The fire had been discovered sooner than expected. He quickened his pace, reaching the kitchen just as the mansion erupted into activity, with slaves and house staff rushing to extinguish the blaze. The kitchen was empty, the outside door standing ajar as Esther had promised. James slipped outside into the rain-soaked night, making his way around the building to a small shed Esther had described. Inside, a trapdoor concealed the entrance to the tunnel system. James descended into darkness, lighting a small candle Esther had left for him. The tunnel was narrow and damp, its brick walls slick with moisture. He followed it according to the map he had memorized, eventually reaching a junction where he was to meet Esther and the others. Minutes passed, with no sign of them. Had something gone wrong? Had they been caught? James was considering whether to continue alone when he heard soft footsteps approaching. He pressed himself against the wall, extinguishing his candle. "Dr. Whitfield," Esther's voice called softly. "Are you here?" James rekindled his candle, relief flooding through him as Esther emerged from a side passage, followed by 4 others, 3 women and a man, all bearing the distinctive light-brown complexion of Madame Lalaurie's breeding program. "Where are the others?" James asked. "Sarah couldn't get away without raising suspicion," Esther explained. "And Thomas?" Her voice faltered. "What happened to Thomas?" James demanded, a sense of dread washing over him. "Dr. Reynolds returned to check on him after the fire was discovered," the male slave explained, his voice low and urgent. He realized Thomas was faking docility. "They've taken him for corrective measures." James's heart sank. After what he had witnessed today, he could imagine what corrective measures might entail. "We have to help him." "It's too late," Esther insisted. "The entire compound is alerted now. The fire spread more quickly than expected. Half the main house is ablaze." As if to confirm her words, they heard distant shouts echoing through the tunnel system. "They're searching the tunnels," the man said, fear evident in his voice. "We need to move now or lose our chance." James faced an impossible choice: continue with the escape and ensure these four reached safety, or attempt to rescue Thomas at the risk of everyone being captured. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. "Which tunnel leads to the laboratory building?" he asked finally. "You can't go there," Esther protested. "It's suicide." "Which tunnel?" James repeated firmly. One of the women pointed to a side passage. "That one leads to the north end of the compound near the laboratory. But they'll be guarding it heavily now." James made his decision. "Esther, take the others and continue to the dock exit. Find your cousin. Get somewhere safe. I'll try to reach Thomas and meet you there if I can." "And if you can't?" Esther asked softly. James handed her the folded pages from his pocket. "Then make sure these reach the authorities in Boston. My colleague's name is Dr. William Ellery Channing at Massachusetts General Hospital. He'll know what to do." Before they could protest further, James took a deep breath and plunged into the side passage, his candle casting grotesque shadows on the ancient brick walls as he rushed toward uncertainty. The tunnel narrowed as James progressed, the ceiling dropping so low that he was forced to crouch. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, a chemical odor that grew stronger as he approached what must be the laboratory building. His candle guttered in the poor air, throwing wild shadows across the curved brick walls. Voices echoed ahead, men shouting orders, the sound of heavy objects being moved. James extinguished his candle and proceeded in darkness, feeling his way along the slimy walls. As he neared what must be the exit, a thin line of light appeared at the base of what looked like a wooden door set into the tunnel wall. Pressing his ear against it, James could hear fragments of frantic conversation, spreading too fast. "Secure the subjects. Madame's orders." The door appeared to open into the basement of the laboratory building. James tried the handle, locked from the other side. He felt around the frame, searching for hinges or any weakness, but found none. This entrance was designed to open only one way. Just as he was considering backtracking to find another approach, the door suddenly swung open, and James found himself face to face with a guard carrying a lantern. "Who?" the guard began, but James didn't let him finish. Using the element of surprise, he drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him stumbling backward. The lantern crashed to the floor but didn't extinguish, illuminating a stone-walled chamber lined with cells. The guard recovered quickly, reaching for a pistol at his belt, but James was faster. He tackled the man, and they fell together, struggling for control of the weapon. The guard was younger and stronger, but desperation gave James an edge. He managed to slam the man's wrist against the stone floor, causing him to drop the pistol. The fight that followed was brief and brutal. James had never considered himself a violent man, but the horrors he had witnessed over the past 2 days fueled a rage he hadn't known he possessed. When the guard finally lay unconscious, James dragged him into the tunnel and took his keys and pistol. The basement contained 6 cells with barred doors. Most stood empty, their occupants presumably evacuated when the fire was discovered, but in the farthest cell, a figure lay motionless on a narrow cot. "Thomas," James called softly, approaching with the lantern. The figure stirred slightly. As the light fell across his face, James saw that it was indeed Thomas, though barely recognizable. His face was swollen from a savage beating, one eye completely closed. But worse was the fresh bandage covering the other eye, evidence that Dr. Reynolds had completed the procedure that James had interrupted earlier. "Thomas, it's Dr. Whitfield," James said urgently, trying each key in the lock until he found the one that worked. "Can you hear me? Can you walk?" Thomas turned his head toward James's voice. "I can hear," he whispered, his voice raspy. They took one eye, but I can walk." James helped him to his feet, supporting him as they moved toward the tunnel entrance. "There's a fire in the main house," he explained quickly. "Everyone's distracted. We're going to escape through the tunnels." Others? Thomas managed to ask. Esther and 4 more are already on their way out, James assured him. We need to hurry. But as they reached the tunnel door, shouts from above indicated that more guards were approaching. The basement had 2 exits, the stairs leading up to the main laboratory, and a second door that presumably led outside. With no time to return to the tunnel, James guided Thomas toward this second door, hoping it wasn't locked. The door opened onto a small courtyard behind the laboratory building. Rain continued to fall, reducing visibility, a blessing under the circumstances. In the distance, the main house was clearly visible, flames licking from its windows despite the downpour. Figures rushed about with buckets and blankets, attempting to control the blaze. The breeding quarters, Thomas gasped, pointing toward a building on the far side of the compound. There are still people inside. James hesitated. His plan had been to escape with Thomas through the tunnels, but that route was now blocked. Attempting to cross the open compound to reach the breeding quarters would expose them to anyone who looked their way. We need to get you to safety first, James insisted. Thomas gripped his arm with surprising strength. Not without the others. Sarah is there, and my brother. The anguish in his voice was impossible to ignore. James knew that leaving others behind would haunt him forever, regardless of how many he managed to save, and if Madame Lalaury's subjects were being left locked in their quarters while the compound burned. All right, he conceded, but we'll need a distraction. Looking around the courtyard, James spotted a small stable. Inside, several horses shifted nervously, disturbed by the commotion from the main house. A plan formed quickly in his mind. Wait here, he instructed Thomas, helping him to sit against the wall where he would be hidden from casual view. I'll be right back. James approached the stable cautiously. The single guard normally posted there had apparently joined the firefighting efforts, leaving the horses unattended. James selected a length of rope hanging on the wall and used it to tie the main doors open. Then he moved to the rear of the stable, where barrels of feed were stored. Tipping one over, he created a trail of grain leading outside. Finally, he took the lantern he had carried from the basement and set fire to a pile of hay near the back of the building. The effect was immediate. As smoke filled the stable, the horses grew frantic. Several broke free of their stalls and bolted through the open doors, following the trail of grain across the compound. Shouts of alarm rose as guards and slaves alike rushed to control the panicked animals. James returned to Thomas and helped him to his feet. Now's our chance. Stay close to me. Taking advantage of the chaos, they made their way along the edge of the compound, keeping to the shadows. The rain intensified, helping to conceal their movement. As they approached the breeding quarters, James was dismayed to see a heavy lock on the main door. There's a side entrance, Thomas whispered, for the doctors and guards. They found the smaller door at the rear of the building. It too was locked, but the pistol James had taken from the guard provided a solution. Wrapping the weapon in his coat to muffle the sound, he fired at the lock mechanism. The door swung open. Inside, the breeding quarters were eerily quiet. Had the occupants already been evacuated? James and Thomas moved cautiously down the central corridor, checking each room. Most were empty, but in a few, terrified men and women huddled on their beds, apparently forgotten or deliberately left behind. They locked us in when the fire started, a young woman explained as Thomas embraced her, Sarah presumably. Said they'd come back for us after securing the prime breeding stock. James's blood boiled at this casual cruelty. How many of you are there? 11 still here, Thomas's brother replied, a younger version of Thomas with the same defiant eyes. The others were taken to the city yesterday for a private auction. We're leaving, James announced. All of us. Right now. To where? Someone asked. They'll hunt us down. The docks first, James explained, where we'll meet Esther and the others. Then north, via the Underground Railroad. He looked at their doubtful faces. I have evidence of what's happened here, he added. Documentation that will expose Madame Lalaury's crimes. This seemed to convince them. Moving as a group, They left the breeding quarters through the side entrance. The compound was still in chaos, with the main house now fully engulfed in flames, despite the rain and the frantic efforts to save it. Guards and slaves ran in all directions, some carrying furniture and valuables from the burning mansion, others attempting to control the fire. "Stay together," James instructed. "Move toward the south gate. Act as if you're following orders to evacuate." No, the strategy worked surprisingly well. In the confusion, a group of slaves moving with apparent purpose attracted little attention. They had almost reached the gate when a voice called out, "Stop! Those are breeding subjects." Dr. Reynolds stood blocking their path, his medical bag in one hand and a pistol in the other. His normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, his coat singed and his face smudged with soot. "Get back to your quarters immediately," he commanded. "These subjects are valuable property and must be secured." James stepped forward, raising his own pistol. "They are human beings, Doctor, not property, and they're leaving this place of horrors." Reynolds' eyes widened in recognition. "Doctor Whitfield, I should have known. Madame Lalaurie was too trusting of your scientific curiosity." He gestured with his pistol. "You've destroyed decades of vital research with your northern interference. Do you have any idea of the scientific value of what you've burned tonight?" "I've seen your science," James replied coldly. "It's nothing but sadism disguised as progress." Reynolds's face contorted with rage. "You understand nothing. We were perfecting humanity, creating a better breed of—" The crack of a pistol interrupted him. Reynolds staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face as he clutched his chest. James turned to see Thomas standing, with his arm extended, James's pistol in his hand. "For my mother," Thomas said quietly, "and for all the others." There was no time to process what had happened. Shouts indicated that guards had heard the gunshot and were running toward them. The group pushed through the gate and into the darkness beyond the compound walls. The journey to the docks was a nightmare of mud-slicked roads and constant fear of pursuit. They avoided the main streets of New Orleans, keeping to alleys and service paths. The rain continued to fall, drenching them but also covering their tracks and reducing visibility for any pursuers. By dawn, they reached the waterfront. As promised, Esther was waiting with her cousin, a dock worker who had secured temporary shelter in a warehouse filled with cotton bales awaiting shipment. "We thought you weren't coming," Esther said, embracing first Thomas and then, to his surprise, James. "When we heard the fire had spread." "It worked too well," James admitted. "The entire main house was ablaze when we left, but we brought more people out." He surveyed the group, 16 souls in total, including himself, all exhausted, wet and terrified, but free. Esther's cousin spoke up. "I can hide you here for a day, maybe 2. After that, the authorities will be searching every warehouse on the docks." "Is there a ship bound for the north?" James asked. "A merchant vessel leaves for Baltimore tomorrow at noon," the man replied. "The captain owes me a favor, but hiding this many people—" He shook his head doubtfully. "We have money," Thomas's brother spoke up, producing a small pouch. "We've been saving for years, those of us who worked in the house and could take a few coins here and there." James added his own funds to the pool. "And I have these," he said, producing the copied pages of Madame Lalaurie's records. "Evidence that will ensure justice is done, even if we're caught." As the group settled into their hiding place among the cotton bales, James found himself sitting beside Thomas, who was having his injuries tended by Sarah. "What do you think happened to her?" Thomas asked quietly. "To Madame Lalaurie." James thought of the burning mansion, of the frantic efforts to save it, of the woman who had created such elaborate suffering in the name of science. "I don't know," he admitted, "but even if she survived, her work is destroyed, her records burned, her reputation will be ruined when these documents reach Boston." Thomas nodded slowly. "It's not enough," he said. "Not for what she did to so many, but it's a beginning." He turned his face toward James, the bandage over his missing eye a stark reminder of the price he had paid. "You kept your word, Dr. Whitfield. You helped us. Why?" James considered the question carefully. Because science without humanity isn't science at all, he said finally. It's just cruelty with a veneer of respectability. What Madame Lalaurie was doing wasn't progress. It was a perversion of everything true science stands for. As exhaustion finally overtook them, the group slept fitfully among the cotton bales, their future uncertain, but their present reality transformatively different from what it had been just 24 hours earlier. They were no longer subjects, specimens, or property. They were human beings with names, histories, and now perhaps a future of their own choosing. This was only the beginning. In the Darkness continues in Part 2. Subscribe now so you don't miss it.